Everyone laughed when a black girl walked up to the supercomputer. In a minute, she was running what the best engineers couldn't. But what she discovered in the code revealed a secret that had been tried to be buried for decades. A secret, a disappearance, a genius name erased from history, and a granddaughter who dared to tell the truth. Want to know how it all ends? Subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more real and unbelievable stories to come. The glass panels of the sky dome shimmered in the morning sun, casting broken rainbows across the polished marble floors of the auditorium. High above, delicate drones drifted lazily through the air, scanning ID badges, relaying holographic welcome messages, and occasionally flashing bright corporate slogans like, "The future is thinking." Inside, hundreds of the most influential minds in artificial intelligence had gathered for the NeuroFuture 2045 Summit, a week-long showcase of the world's most advanced cognitive technologies. The buzz in the crowd felt electric, heightened by the promise of something historic. All eyes were on the main stage, where the platinum-white logo of Syntheon Dynamics pulsed across a 30-foot-wide curved screen. At center stage stood a sleek podium encased in translucent alloy. Behind it, hidden by a silk cover, was the company's latest marvel, the Aurora cognitive engine, billed as the first fully quantum sentient artificial intelligence system. Executives from across the globe had flown in, most of them wearing variations of the same polished suit, the same sterile smile. Media teams stood poised with lens drones, while the online livestream audience had already surpassed 3 million viewers. The air smelled faintly of ozone and expectation. From backstage, CEO Nolan Vance appeared. Tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed in a custom dark graphite suit, he walked with the poise of a man who had never known doubt. With a dramatic flourish, he swept the cover away. Gasps spread through the room as the engine beneath was revealed, an obsidian core surrounded by radial rings of glowing sapphire. Nanofibers pulsed like veins beneath its skin. Aurora. Vance took a breath and launched into his monologue, practiced yet charismatic, every word weighed for maximum resonance. He spoke of humanity's threshold, of machines that could anticipate needs, learn with intuition, and offer solutions faster than any human mind. He gestured toward the engine, promising that this demonstration would mark the beginning of a new cognitive age. He turned to the control panel, pressed the initialization sequence, and smiled as the humming began. Then, silence. At first, it was mistaken for part of the sequence. The system's holographic display blinked uncertainly, lines of code cascading, then freezing mid-execution. Aurora flickered, then dimmed. Vance's smile twitched. He tapped the panel again, this time harder. No response. Engineers backstage began murmuring. Another button press, a restart command, a fail-safe trigger. Nothing. The room began to shift. Whispers gave way to muttered concerns. The large screen above the stage now displayed an error. System integrity fault. Quantum core unresponsive. Vance stood rigid, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. He tried to mask it with his posture, but it was no use. The machine that was supposed to change the world had gone dark before the first command had even been issued. Journalists started filming more aggressively. Investors leaned toward one another, whispering, eyes hard. In the second row, barely visible amidst the gathering of power suits and tech journalists, sat a teenage girl in a faded burgundy hoodie. Her posture was calm, but her eyes were locked onto the screen, tracing each flickering character, absorbing each failed process. Her name was Naomi Jackson, and no one noticed her, yet. She sat beside her grandfather, Walter, who wore the blue coveralls of the maintenance crew. He had managed the night crew shift for nearly 20 years at the Sky Dome. Naomi was there because her school was on break, and Walter didn't like to leave her alone in their South Side apartment. He trusted her with machines more than he trusted the streets. Naomi's fingers drummed lightly on her old tablet, the one her grandmother had given her years ago. Its frame was scratched, the stylus tip slightly warped, but it was loaded with something more valuable than any showroom processor. Hundreds of handwritten pages, diagrams, and notations. Then it happened. From the far side of the control pit, one of the engineers, a young man with expensive glasses and a streak of entitlement in his voice, pointed toward the audience with a smirk. "Maybe we should let Jackson's kid take a look," he said, chuckling. "Might have better luck than we are." A wave of laughter spread through the room. The camera drones picked it up. The audience, unsure if the comment was staged, joined in. Vance gave a tight smile, his voice oozing casual dismissal as he echoed, "Yes, perhaps the janitor's granddaughter has a magic touch." Naomi's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. Walter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes down. He muttered something under his breath, urging her to stay still, to let it go. She didn't. Naomi stood slowly, her movements deliberate. The room hadn't registered her yet, just another face in the crowd. She moved toward the stage, not with drama, but with gravity. The laughter tapered. Whispers returned. One of the security guards looked toward the engineers for direction, but no one stopped her. It was as if the collective embarrassment paralyzed authority. She reached the edge of the platform, held up her tablet, and glanced at the console. Her voice, soft but clear, cut the air. "May I?" For a second, no one responded. Vance, his pride bleeding through his clenched jaw, gestured half-heartedly with an open palm. "By all means." Phones rose like a swarm of insects. Naomi climbed the 2 steps to the console and set her tablet beside the terminal. Her fingers hovered over the screen. On her tablet, familiar architecture danced into view. The skeleton of Aurora, except older. Her version predated this machine, but it was unmistakably connected. Layer by layer, she saw the similarities. But where Aurora had faltered, her grandmother's designs offered stability, redundancy, elegance. The memory of her grandmother, Ruby Jackson, surged into her thoughts. The quiet nights in their cluttered living room, the yellowed engineering manuals, the whispered warnings not to trust institutions that stole credit and erased names. Ruby had known. Ruby had fought. And now, her code had surfaced again, though twisted and weakened by others. Naomi scanned the console. The quantum kernel was misfiring because of a conflict in the predictive matrix. It was a rare kind of failure, one Ruby had warned about, and one Naomi had already theorized about in her own notes. With her stylus, Naomi typed a short patch, barely 40 lines of code. She compiled it locally on her tablet, then transferred it via hardline into the console. One final command. Then silence again. A technician scoffed. Another rolled their eyes. A few people turned away, muttering about publicity stunts. Then Aurora came to life. Not just powered, transformed. The system lit up, each segment pulsing with symphonic rhythm. The display screen behind them shifted into its full operational sequence. Live data began streaming. Neural mesh networks stabilized. For the first time since its construction, Aurora achieved complete synchronization. The crowd went silent, like someone had dropped a curtain of sound. Even Vance stared, his mouth slightly open. Naomi stepped back, her breath shallow. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had touched the future and rebooted it. Someone near the back began to clap. Tentatively, then, with growing strength, others joined, but the applause wasn't joyful. It was stunned, uncertain, almost reverent. Naomi didn't smile. She simply returned to her tablet, unplugged it, and turned away. Her job was done. But the questions had only begun, and behind every question waited a ghost, a brilliant woman erased from history whose legacy had just spoken through her granddaughter's hands. As Naomi descended the steps, a ripple spread through the auditorium. Not a whisper, not noise, but awareness. Something had shifted. Something was about to rise. And somewhere, beneath all the glass and applause, the past had started knocking on the door of the present. The buzz that had followed Naomi's quiet intervention refused to die down. The air inside the Sky Dome had shifted. No longer electric with the anticipatory hum of a grand unveiling, but heavy with the weight of something far more dangerous. Revelation. People didn't quite know how to respond. Naomi hadn't delivered a speech. She hadn't declared herself a genius or demanded credit. She had written a few lines of code and walked away. But those few lines had done what millions of dollars, dozens of engineers, and years of planning could not. They had brought Aurora to life. No one stopped her as she made her way off stage. Security stood motionless, unsure of their place now. Her grandfather waited by the same row, eyes wide, clutching his cap in both hands as she returned. Naomi didn't speak. She sat down beside him again, her fingers still curled around the stylus, her jaw tight with the restraint of someone fighting not to shake. Walter reached over and rested a hand on hers. His touch was gentle but firm, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this moment, however surreal it felt. Behind them, the stage had descended into a scramble. Engineers whispered in tight circles. Executives barked into their comms. Technicians reviewed logs, screens flashing and shifting with diagnostic readouts that couldn't explain what had happened. And Nolan Vance, once so composed, paced behind the podium with a restlessness that betrayed both anger and fear. But Naomi wasn't watching. Her eyes were on the tablet in her lap, its aged screen displaying the interface she had memorized 100 times over. She opened a folder labeled Ruby, its icon a crimson flame. Inside were dozens of subfolders, each one tagged with names like Resonance, Veil Proof, Alice 22. The structure wasn't modern, no drag and drop, no slick animations. It was hand-coded, layered like an onion, secured by passphrases and hash verifications. Her grandmother had built a digital labyrinth. Naomi's hand trembled slightly as she navigated through the files. She knew what she was looking for. She'd seen it so many times growing up. Those long nights when Ruby would sit beside her on the couch with a battered laptop, whispering about systems the world wasn't ready for. Diagrams sketched on napkins, equations scribbled on the margins of crossword puzzles. Back then, it had all seemed like a game. A kind of coded lullaby passed down in formulas instead of rhymes. She opened the Cora Schema folder and scanned its contents. There it was, Aurora_seed. The date stamp read September 12, 1987. She tapped to open the file. What emerged was unmistakable. A logic tree, recursive and elegant, spiraling out from a singular node, the same architecture that had just awakened on stage. Line after line, it danced across the screen. Not identical to the system used by Syntheon, but clearly ancestral. A prototype, one generation earlier, yet more stable, more human. Her chest tightened. She wasn't hallucinating. She wasn't just hoping it resembled Aurora. It was Aurora, only purer, cleaner, untouched by corporate dilution. What Syntheon had built was a refined mimicry. The core algorithm, predictive learning via quantum entanglement nodes, was Ruby's. She had written it when she was 34 years old in a forgotten lab, surrounded by men who never wanted her name on the final product. Naomi leaned back and closed her eyes. The sounds of the crowd faded into a low murmur. In her mind, she was back in their small South Side apartment, the one with the leaky windows and the old heater that clanged like a ghost in the night. Her grandmother's voice drifted through memory, soft, smoky, patient. They'll try to say it was their idea. That's how it always goes. But the code remembers who wrote it. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never quite understood what that meant. But now, as she stared at the sequence on her tablet, watching her grandmother's logic intertwine with the machine that had just stunned a global audience, she finally did. Ruby hadn't just written software. She had written identity into her work, and it still lived. From behind, a sudden flash of light snapped Naomi back. A camera drone had hovered closer, its lens locked onto her screen. She snapped the tablet closed and stuffed it into her backpack. A nearby woman, dressed in a sharp red blazer with the Syntheon emblem on her lapel, turned toward her with narrowed eyes. There was something unsettling about the silence in her expression, as if she was analyzing more than just behavior, cataloging responses, calculating risks. Naomi stood. "Let's go," she whispered to her grandfather. Walter nodded and rose beside her. As they exited the row, whispers trailed behind them like smoke. No one dared stop them, but the air buzzed with questions. Naomi walked quickly, her boots thudding softly against the polished floor. Outside the auditorium, the corridors were less crowded. Screens along the walls cycled through event schedules, though some had already been overridden by live coverage of the Miracle reboot. That was what the captions called it. Teenage girl saves flagship AI. Naomi felt her stomach turn. It wasn't a miracle. It was inheritance. They turned a corner and stepped into a quiet lounge. Walter sat heavily into a cushioned chair, wiping his brow. Naomi paced, her mind unraveling threads faster than she could tie them. The implications were massive. Not just for Syntheon, not just for the world, for her. Because if the core of Aurora had been built from Ruby's original design, then someone had taken it, copied it, hidden it, and worse, they had tried to erase its origin. Naomi pulled out the tablet again and opened another folder. This one was labeled Whistler. She had always found the name strange until she learned what it meant. Someone who speaks when silence is expected. Inside were PDFs, email screenshots, audio clips, communications between Ruby and colleagues, timestamps from 1988. Technical reports bearing her name. Then, several months later, the same reports with that name missing. Entire research papers rewritten under male pseudonyms. One file was marked Severance Agreement, RJ. She opened it. The date matched the fall after Ruby had left her lab job. The document was cold, clinical, and filled with legal jargon. It referenced confidential proprietary frameworks, classified work-for-hire structures, and non-disclosure liabilities. Naomi's eyes narrowed. There, buried in the language, was a line that chilled her. All contributions made by employee Ruby Jackson between 1985 and 1988 are property of Sovereign Systems, a division of Synth Tech Holdings. Syntheon. The name had changed, the structure rebranded, but the fingerprints remained. Ruby had built the bones of this company's flagship product. She had been silenced and stripped of authorship, and now, decades later, they had tried to showcase her work without even knowing where it came from. Naomi felt something stir inside her. Not rage, not quite yet, but clarity. She didn't want the spotlight. She didn't care about fame, but truth mattered. And if her grandmother had been buried beneath redacted files and corporate doublespeak, it was time to bring her back. The lounge door opened again. A man in a gray suit entered, holding a conference badge that identified him as an innovation director. He approached slowly, with an apologetic smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Young lady," he said, "I was hoping we could speak, just briefly, about your contribution. The company is impressed." Naomi stared at him. She said nothing. Her grandfather stood, stepping in front of her. "We're leaving," Walter said quietly. The man didn't move to stop them. He just smiled again and handed over a business card. Naomi took it, glanced at the embossed name, then tucked it into her pocket unread. As they walked away, she felt the weight of more than one set of eyes. The code was no longer hidden. The machine had awakened, and something far older, something deeper, had awakened with it. The ghost of Ruby Jackson was moving through the halls of a company that had tried to forget her, but Naomi would not let them. The cold air outside the Sky Dome stung Naomi's face as she and Walter stepped through the revolving glass doors. The world beyond was loud. News drones whirred above the plaza, their metallic wings catching flashes of sunlight, while attendees and bystanders milled along the edge of the massive corporate complex. Yet, for Naomi, everything felt distant, like a dream with no stable ground beneath her feet. Her mind wasn't on the present. It was moving backward through time, retracing the invisible trail that her grandmother had once walked, now barely resurfacing from beneath decades of silence. They walked in near silence for several blocks until they reached the parking lot where Walter's service van waited, parked in the shadow of a towering glass sculpture shaped like a neural network. Naomi climbed into the passenger seat, her tablet clutched tightly against her chest. Walter turned the key, and the van rumbled to life with an aging cough, a mechanical contrast to the sleek hum of the Sky Dome's architecture. He didn't speak until they were several minutes away, the corporate towers shrinking in the side mirror. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the road. Naomi didn't answer right away. She stared at the tablet, watching its dimmed screen reflect her face, her own dark eyes, her mother's cheekbones, her grandmother's fierce brow. A face that carried more than just resemblance, a face that carried memory. "She built it," Naomi said finally. "All of it. The foundation, the structure, even the naming conventions in their modules. They didn't change much at all. They just covered her name in white paint and called it theirs." Walter exhaled through his nose, slow and heavy. "I know." "You knew?" She turned to him, her voice sharper than she intended. "I knew pieces," he said. "Your grandma didn't talk about it much after she left the lab. Said it wasn't safe. Said it wasn't worth trying to fight people who already decided the truth didn't matter." Naomi turned her gaze back to the window. She didn't blame him, not really, but silence, even well-intentioned, had a price. Back at their apartment, the rooms felt smaller than Naomi remembered. The curtains were drawn against the afternoon glare, and dust hung in the slanting light like threads of time, untouched. She dropped her bag on the kitchen table, pulled out the tablet, and opened the archive labeled Whistler again. There were too many documents to read in one night, but one caught her eye. It was a scanned photograph, grainy, bent at the corners. A woman stood in front of a chalkboard mid-sentence, her hand frozen in the act of pointing to a complex network diagram. Her afro was slightly unkempt, her blouse loose at the sleeves, and her expression was somewhere between amused and indignant. The whiteboard behind her read, "Adaptive Mesh Synthesis via Counterfactual Iteration." Week 6. Naomi touched the screen as if she could reach into the moment. Her grandmother had taught this, had led seminars, had spoken with authority in rooms full of people who later would act as though she had never existed. She flipped to the next file, a memo titled Proposal, RJAC/Aurora, Classified. The first page detailed a project funded by Sovereign Systems in 1987, an early-stage initiative to develop quantum cognitive processing nodes based on behavioral feedback loops. The author was Ruby Jackson. Her name was typed clearly in the header. The second page, dated 4 months later, was the same proposal, almost verbatim, except the author's name was gone, replaced by 3 male surnames Naomi didn't recognize. The final page bore a stamp, property of Syntheon Dynamics. The theft wasn't even subtle. It was methodical. Naomi's chest grew tighter with each scroll. File after file confirmed what she already suspected. Her grandmother's departure had not been voluntary. She had tried to blow the whistle. She had filed a complaint, one that was buried, ignored, then sealed. A week later, the lab claimed she had suffered a breakdown. Another week, and she was gone. Not dead, just erased. Naomi wasn't sure how long she stared at the screen. When she finally looked up, the sky outside the window had turned the dusky orange of approaching evening. In the living room, Walter was asleep in his chair, the television playing some ancient western on low volume. Naomi stood quietly and crossed to the bookshelf in the hallway. Ruby's things were still there. Stacked high with technical manuals and coding anthologies, the shelf had become something of a shrine, an accidental archive of genius no one outside their family ever acknowledged. Naomi reached for a faded spiral notebook, its pages yellowed with time and smudged with graphite fingerprints. Inside were hand-drawn schematics of early versions of the quantum logic cores. They were dated, organized by iteration. Some were even labeled with personal notes. Fails on multi-predictive load. Try loop damping. Too fast. Saturation occurs before stabilization. Fix via subnode filters. Even the mistakes were art. Her fingers traced the spiral edge, the sensation grounding her. She turned to a blank page and began writing. Her own thoughts, her own questions. What was she supposed to do with this knowledge? Expose them? Fight a company with a global legal team and political power? Could she make anyone care? And what would Ruby have done? A memory surfaced. Naomi, age 8, curled on the couch under a blanket while Ruby made tea in the kitchen. The old woman's voice carried clearly from across the apartment. They want us to believe we're lucky to be in the room. But baby, we built the room. We coded the door. We installed the damn lights. Naomi smiled, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Ruby had always known she wouldn't live to see justice, but she had believed someone else might. The next morning arrived with an inbox full of messages. Her personal account, which had been dormant for months, now contained dozens of requests. Some were reporters. Some were students. Some were strangers who had seen the video of her on stage and wanted to know who she was. The footage had spread. It had been clipped, remixed, captioned, and broadcast across platforms. Even mainstream networks had picked it up. But the most important message wasn't from a journalist. It came from someone named Dr. Elena Brooks. Elena's email was concise but careful. She had been a junior researcher under Ruby back in the 80s. She still had access to internal company logs, records no one was supposed to keep. and she remembered what happened. She had stayed quiet out of fear, but now, after what Naomi had done, she was ready to speak. Naomi replied within minutes. They set a meeting for that afternoon at a library across the city. Naomi left the apartment bundled in layers against the cold, her backpack heavier now with the weight of history. The library was small and dimly lit, with a dusty smell of paper and plastic. Dr. Brooks was already seated near the back, a woman in her 60s with iron-gray curls and eyes that flickered with unspent guilt. She wore a dark coat and had a manila folder clutched tightly in her hands. When Naomi approached, she stood. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Dr. Brooks opened the folder and spread its contents on the table. Technical evaluations, notes from internal meetings, even a lab access log showing Ruby's entry into a secure room the night her project was supposedly reassigned. One document, typed hastily, bore the words, "Redirect RJAC assets to core team. Strip credits." Naomi stared at it until the letters blurred. Then she whispered the name that had been in her head all morning. "Why?" Dr. Brooks sighed. She made them uncomfortable. She was better than them, quieter, smarter, and black. That was 3 strikes. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any accusation. On her way home, Naomi watched the city pass by in shades of gray and steel. The people on the sidewalks, the cars, the screens flashing advertisements, it all felt like noise. But beneath it, something had shifted. The ghost of Ruby Jackson was no longer a whisper in the margins. She was a presence now, a name rising like smoke from the places meant to suffocate it, and Naomi would not let her be buried again. The wind had picked up that night. It whispered through the cracks in the old apartment windows, pushing against the glass as if trying to join Naomi at her desk. She sat hunched over her tablet, eyes dry from too many hours of reading, her fingers scrolling through lines of archived code and grainy scans. The room smelled faintly of graphite and worn plastic. Her grandmother's notebook lay open beside her, its yellowed pages creased at the corners, the ink faded but still fierce. Naomi didn't remember falling asleep. When she opened her eyes again, the screen had gone dark and the city outside had already begun to stir. She checked her messages. The inbox had multiplied overnight, hundreds now. The topmost subject lines carried names she didn't recognize, but one word kept appearing over and over, like a drumbeat. Ruby. Someone had clipped the footage from the Sky Dome and uploaded it with a title that Naomi never would have chosen. The Ghost in the Machine, granddaughter of erased genius resurrects AI. The video had exploded across social media platforms. By mid-morning, it had been viewed over 4 million times. A trending hashtag had emerged, #CodeWashers. Naomi scrolled through the flood of commentary. Some were skeptical, others awestruck. A few accused her of fabricating the connection, but most were drawn in by the story. The teenage girl who had repaired the most advanced AI on Earth using a line of code written by her grandmother decades earlier. There was something magnetic about the symmetry, a legacy interrupted and restored, a line unbroken. She found herself tagged in dozens of posts. Her face, grainy and lit by the glow of the terminal, had become a symbol, though she had never asked for it. One post caught her eye. A screen recording of her code injection, slowed down and analyzed line by a computer science professor from Stanford. He had overlaid it with commentary praising its efficiency, its elegance, its refusal to conform to modern over-engineering. Another clip showed a side-by-side comparison between Ruby's 1987 prototype and the current Aurora structure. The similarities were undeniable. Naomi felt a strange hollowness in her chest. This was bigger than her now. It had escaped the confines of her mind, of her apartment, of the careful silence she had lived within her entire life. The story was moving on its own, and it was only gaining speed. That afternoon, the first call came. A producer from a national morning show left a voicemail inviting Naomi to appear for an interview. Minutes later, another offer arrived, this time from a documentary filmmaker. Then, a message from a nonprofit that supported underrepresented youth in STEM, offering to fund her education. And beneath it all, buried in the notifications, was a single text from a number with no name attached. "I remember, Ruby. I have something you need to see. I was there." Naomi stared at it for a long time before replying. She asked for a meeting place. The reply came almost instantly. 7 p.m., 14th and Astor, basement level, don't bring anyone. Walter was at the grocery store when she slipped out. She left a note on the fridge, just in case, but told herself it was probably just another admirer, someone who wanted to feel important. Still, as she boarded the train, her palms were slick with nerves. The address led her to a half-forgotten research library nestled between two towers, its stone facade chipped by decades of wind. Inside, a narrow staircase spiraled down into a basement level once used for archival storage. Naomi stepped carefully, her backpack pressed against her side, her footsteps echoing across cold tile. The room at the bottom was dimly lit. Metal shelves lined the walls, heavy with unscanned documents and reels. A woman waited by one of the desks, wrapped in a long wool coat, her gray hair pulled into a knot. She looked up as Naomi entered, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You're Ruby's granddaughter," she said. Naomi nodded. "You knew her?" "I was a junior analyst. My name's Lillian Cho. Ruby trained me." Lillian didn't waste time. She pulled the flash drive from her coat and slid it across the table. Before she was forced out, she backed up everything to an off-site terminal. Most of it was wiped, but not all. "These files are encrypted. She used a personal cipher. I couldn't crack it, but you might be able to." Naomi took the drive, her heart pounding. Why now? Because people are listening again, and because I waited too long already. They told us to forget her, told us to call her unstable. Brilliant but erratic, said it was for the good of the project. "She wasn't unstable," Naomi said. "No," Lillian replied. "She was the best we ever had." When Naomi got home, Walter was already sitting at the kitchen table, the note she had left still clutched in his hand. His face was unreadable. "I saw the feed," he said. "You're everywhere." Naomi sat across from him, carefully placing the flash drive between them. "Then I need to make sure what comes next is the truth." They spent the evening unlocking it. Ruby's cipher wasn't easy. It was personal, layered in musical notation, names, phrases only Naomi would recognize. It took hours, but piece by piece, the files began to open. First came logs, emails between executives, annotations about Ruby's attitude, her unwillingness to share ownership. Then came internal reports, efficiency tests comparing her prototype to the newer versions. Every time, hers performed better. The final folder was labeled Silencing. Inside were legal memos discussing how to reframe her exit from the company, public statements prepared in advance, NDAs, severance clauses. Naomi stared at the last document for a long time. It was a memo from 1989 addressed to Synthion's board of directors. The subject line was chilling. Preemptive Reputation Control, R. Jackson. They had buried her on purpose, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. She uploaded everything to a secure cloud folder, encrypted it, then wrote a letter. It began with a single line. "My name is Naomi Jackson. I am the granddaughter of Ruby Jackson, and this is what they tried to hide." She didn't send it yet. She waited. The next morning, a storm had broken over the city. Naomi watched the rain carve lines across the window pane while her phone buzzed nonstop. The video had passed 10 million views. Reporters stood outside the Sky Dome. Protesters gathered with signs that read, "Give Ruby credit," and "Who writes the code?" Anonymous users began posting comparisons between Ruby's work and that of other forgotten inventors. Women, especially black women, erased from patent filings, textbooks, and history. The dominoes had started falling. A young engineer at Syntheon resigned publicly, citing Naomi's video as the catalyst. Another released a statement apologizing for their silence. Internal documents began leaking. Someone uploaded meeting notes to a whistleblower site showing that Syntheon executives had known about Ruby's contributions for years and had chosen to omit her from the company history. Naomi released the letter that evening. The cloud link spread like wildfire. Within hours, major news outlets picked it up. Her words were quoted on television. Journalists requested interviews. University professors launched initiatives to review old records for misattributed work. By the end of the week, Syntheon Dynamics issued a public statement calling the matter an evolving investigation. The CEO refused to step down, but was noticeably absent from the next public appearance. Shareholders called for transparency. An independent ethics committee was formed. But the most powerful moment came from a video Naomi didn't expect. It was a recording from 1990, grainy, low resolution. Ruby stood in a small auditorium, speaking to a group of young women at a community college. Her voice was clear, her posture proud. "They say the code doesn't remember," she told them, "but I do. I remember every line, every loop, every bug, every breakthrough. They can strip my name from the file, but they can't strip it from me." Naomi watched that video a dozen times. Each time she cried. Her grandmother had never stopped fighting. She had just fought in the quiet, hoping someone would one day hear. Now they were hearing. The code was no longer hidden. The truth was no longer silenced. And Naomi Jackson, unwilling, unpolished, unapologetic, had become the voice her grandmother was denied. The chain reaction had begun, and nothing could stop it now. The days that followed Naomi's public release of the encrypted files passed in a surreal blur. It was as though someone had opened a dam that had held for decades. The truth, long buried and dismissed as folklore within a sterile corporate world, had now been unleashed with the force of memory and evidence colliding in real time. And it moved fast, faster than any executive at Syntheon Dynamics had anticipated, faster than the board could contain, faster than Naomi herself had imagined possible. But she did not step away from it. Not now. Not anymore. By midweek, headlines had saturated every major news platform. Not just tech blogs or niche AI journals, but global media, television, radio, even the evening papers. They all led with her name and the name that had until recently belonged only to whispers and fading documents, Ruby Jackson. Feature articles profiled Naomi as the teenage genius who had resurrected a legacy. Some of them got the details wrong. Many reduced Ruby's story to a convenient tragedy or painted Naomi as a prodigy plucked from obscurity. But the central truth, once spoken aloud, had caught fire. Ruby had been brilliant. Ruby had been erased. and Naomi had restored her voice. Outside Synthion's towering headquarters in Midtown, protesters gathered every day. It began with only a handful of students and local activists holding hand-lettered signs with messages like "Code was hers" and "Give Ruby credit." But soon, the crowd swelled. University professors, tech employees, and civil rights leaders joined them. Engineers who had once idolized Synthion's accomplishments now stood shoulder to shoulder, chanting Ruby's name into megaphones and calling for resignations, audits, and accountability. A mural appeared on the side of a building across the street from the headquarters, painted overnight. It showed Ruby Jackson at a terminal, fingers suspended midair over a glowing keyboard, eyes fierce, her afro haloed in circuitry. Above her head, 3 words stretched across the bricks in crimson spray paint. "We remember now." Naomi visited the mural in secret on a Thursday afternoon, hoodie pulled up, mask in place. She stared at the paint until it blurred, until the ghost of her grandmother seemed to step out from the wall and rest her hand on Naomi's shoulder. For a moment, it felt less like grief and more like presence. But not all the responses were supportive. Alongside the messages of admiration and solidarity came a different tide, one composed of disbelief, fear, and resentment. Anonymous accounts accused Naomi of fabrication. Conspiracy threads claimed she had faked the documents. Trolls flooded her inbox with threats. Some called her arrogant, others naive, still others dangerous. One commentator on a televised panel smirked and asked if perhaps Naomi had misunderstood her grandmother's work. After all, he said, how could a teenage girl know more than the leading engineers of her time? Naomi didn't respond to any of them. Not directly. She knew better than to throw her energy into shouting matches with people whose only power came from disbelief. But the noise lingered, and sometimes late at night when the apartment was still and her grandfather had gone to bed, it would wrap around her like a fog, whispering doubts. Had she done enough? Had she gone too far? Was she truly strong enough to carry this burden? It was Walter who reminded her of the answer. On a quiet Friday morning, he placed an old photograph on the kitchen table while she was eating cereal, her eyes still heavy with exhaustion. It showed Ruby in her 30s, standing in a cluttered lab with a soldering iron in one hand and a chalk-streaked blackboard behind her. Her expression was not one of anger, but clarity. She looked like someone who had already made peace with being right before her time. She always said the worst thing they ever gave her wasn't the silence, Walter said. It was the doubt. But she never let it in. And you shouldn't either. Naomi nodded slowly, her throat too tight to speak. That afternoon, she was invited to a roundtable discussion at the local university, organized by the Black Women in STEM Collective. The invitation read like a love letter. You are not alone. You are part of a long line. Come, take your seat. Naomi hesitated, then agreed. The auditorium was smaller than the Sky Dome, but it felt heavier somehow. As she stepped onto the stage, she saw the faces of women who reminded her of Ruby. Brilliant, tired, resilient. Professors, researchers, students. Each of them carried their own version of the silence Naomi had helped shatter. When she began to speak, it was not with rehearsed lines or polished statements. She spoke the way her grandmother used to speak in their living room late at night, when the world outside felt like too much. I didn't want to become anything special, Naomi told them. I just didn't want her work to disappear. A hush settled over the room. Some people cried, others simply nodded. One older woman stood at the back and whispered, almost to herself, Ruby taught me to code in Fortran. She stayed late after hours just to make sure I got it right. They said she was too demanding, but she made me believe I belonged in the room. That same night, Naomi received a private message from someone inside Syntheon. The sender used a fake name, but the contents of the email were real. Attached were internal memos showing that the executive team had known about Ruby's authorship for over a decade. A buried patent dispute, an old settlement offer never delivered. They had buried it all. She didn't hesitate. She released the documents. By the next morning, #Syntheon Lied was trending worldwide. Shareholders called emergency meetings. The CEO released a video statement that felt as empty as the spaces Ruby had once filled. He apologized for the misunderstanding, blamed past leadership, and vowed to look into the matter. No one believed him. Protests escalated. Employees staged a walkout. Several engineers resigned publicly, citing ethical concerns. Meanwhile, Naomi continued her work, giving interviews, attending forums, helping organize online archives of erased contributions by Black women in science and technology. With help from allies in academia, she launched the Digital Equity Archive, a searchable database of neglected inventors and scientists whose names had been obscured or replaced. Within days, submissions poured in from all over the world. For the first time in her life, Naomi felt as though she was not speaking into a void, but into a chorus. Yet, it was not victory she felt. Not yet. The damage done to her grandmother could not be undone by hashtags or headlines. Ruby would never see her name restored in the papers where it had once been erased. She would never know that the machine she built had finally stood tall, but she had left something stronger than recognition behind. She had left Naomi. On the eve of the third week since the conference, Naomi stood alone in the break room of a community center on the south side. It was a quiet, familiar space where Ruby had once volunteered. The walls were lined with old posters and community flyers. A small crowd had gathered in the adjacent room for a celebration in Naomi's honor, a grassroots award for truth-telling in tech. But Naomi wasn't thinking about the award. She was thinking about the silence. The long, heavy silence that her grandmother had carried and that she had finally broken. She pulled out her tablet, opened Ruby's code again, and stared at the clean, perfect lines. The logic hadn't aged. It was still sound, still singing. She remembered something Ruby used to say on late nights when they sat side by side, her grandmother reading equations like lullabies. They think silence is safe, that if you say nothing they can't touch you, but silence is just another name for erasure. And baby, we were never born to be silent. Naomi closed the tablet and walked into the next room. The crowd stood as she entered, not because she was famous, but because they recognized her, not as a symbol or a miracle or a headline. They recognized her as Ruby's granddaughter, and as her own name. And the silence, at last, was gone. By the time the fourth week passed since Naomi had uploaded the first fragments of her grandmother's files, the narrative had grown larger than even she could follow. What had begun as a single act of courage on stage, an almost impulsive, emotionally charged decision to stand against silence, had rippled outward into something vast and national in scale. She watched from the modest living room where Ruby had once scribbled algorithms on the backs of supermarket receipts, as panels of experts now sat under bright studio lights dissecting the implications of her grandmother's code. They spoke of ethics and innovation, of institutional memory and systemic erasure, but they also spoke of repair. For the first time in Naomi's life, they were using Ruby's name not as an anecdote or rumor, but as fact. And yet, even amid the storm of attention, Naomi remained grounded. She still walked the same cracked sidewalk to the corner store. Still took the train with her grandfather when he went into the city for maintenance work. She declined offers to fly to California or New York, to sit on morning shows or tech summits, not out of arrogance or fear, but because her work wasn't finished. The code, the database, the search for names like rubies, buried and silenced, still demanded her attention. She had built something now, something more important than a single truth, a map. The Digital Equity Archive had grown exponentially. What had started as a simple Git-based depository for Ruby's restored documentation had evolved into a collaborative, living project. With help from academics, retired scientists, engineers, and curious volunteers, Naomi had overseen the creation of the first open-source database dedicated to the retrieval and authentication of erased or misattributed technological contributions by marginalized inventors. Within 2 weeks, it had received over 2,000 verified submissions. Names that had never appeared in textbooks surfaced. Women whose patents had been filed under supervisors' names. Black engineers whose prototypes had launched industries without their faces on a single brochure. Naomi didn't do this work alone. That, too, was part of the legacy. Her story had awakened something collective. Dozens of high school and college students joined the archive as researchers and coders. They came from everywhere: Detroit, Oakland, Jackson, Brooklyn. Most of them had stories of their own, stories of teachers who had never taken them seriously, of science fairs where their ideas were overlooked, of parents who worked 2 jobs and still bought them second-hand laptops because they saw something in their children that the world refused to name. Every Friday evening, Naomi led open sessions through a live stream broadcast. They called it Code Beyond Credit, and it became a kind of ritual. One week, they dissected Ruby's predictive loop theory. Another, they focused on Noriko Tanaka, a Japanese-American software engineer whose early contributions to cybernetics had been credited to a male colleague. Another week, they studied Fatima El-Ghazali, a North African physicist who had designed electromagnetic shield modules decades before they were patented by Western defense contractors. Naomi watched the chat during each session, watched it fill with fire and curiosity. Teenagers asked questions. Retired professors offered insights. Sometimes survivors of this systemic forgetting simply typed, "I see her now." That was all Naomi had ever wanted. Then came the letter from Congress. It arrived as a thick envelope, hand-delivered and sealed in formal parchment. Inside was a printed declaration, flanked by signatures from members of the Senate Committee on Scientific Integrity. The language was ceremonial but clear. In acknowledgement of the historic injustice committed against Ruby Jackson and other silenced innovators, Congress had approved the establishment of a national program, the Jackson Initiative. The Jackson Initiative was more than a gesture. It was a policy. A funded, federally backed program to provide scholarships, legal advocacy, archival grants, and research platforms to support young inventors from marginalized communities. It promised transparency in patent attributions, equitable access to publishing, and, most importantly, a network of mentors trained to recognize and protect vulnerable contributors from corporate theft. Naomi read the letter 3 times before she let herself believe it was real. She was invited to sit on the advisory council, not as a figurehead or honorary consultant, but as its first official member and co-author of its Research Integrity Charter. The terms made it clear. This was not a reward for what she had done. It was a responsibility for what she would now be part of building. Her grandfather stood beside her at the kitchen sink when she read it aloud. The evening light slanted through the blinds, casting long shadows across the counter where Ruby had once set her mug of tea every morning. Walter said nothing at first. Then he took the letter from her hands, folded it once with care, and said, "She would have been proud, not just of the program, of you. You didn't just carry her work forward, you made room for others." Naomi nodded, but her throat ached too much to answer. A week later, she stood at a press conference in Washington, D.C., behind a podium draped in the seal of the United States Department of Scientific Innovation. Her hands didn't shake. She wore a tailored blazer the color of storm clouds, and at her neck a pendant in the shape of a flame. It had been Ruby's, given to her on the day she started her first job in the lab. Naomi spoke not from a speech, but from memory. She talked about how silence is a system, how it does not merely forget, but erases with purpose, how some minds were built with brilliance only to be buried because they came in bodies the industry did not want to credit. She named names, Ruby's and others. And then she turned from the microphone and handed the signed charter of the Jackson Initiative to the acting secretary. The room rose in a standing ovation, but it was not the applause Naomi remembered most. It was the quiet, a sacred stillness, as if the ancestors who had once typed code in the shadows had all gathered in that room, bearing witness. Back in Chicago, Naomi returned not to cameras or galas, but to the community center on the south side. It had always been Ruby's second home. Naomi had promised herself she would finish what her grandmother started there. With a grant from the initiative, she launched the Code Ruby Institute, an after-school program and research incubator for teenagers in under-resourced districts. They met in classrooms that still had cracked windows and flickering lights, but now those rooms thrummed with questions and circuits and laughter. Naomi taught 3 days a week. The rest of the time she mentored remotely, coordinated projects, and quietly worked on her own code, the one idea she had never yet dared to share, not even with Ruby. She called it the Livin' Ledger. It was a decentralized, blockchain-powered archive designed not just to preserve ideas, but to timestamp and lock authorship at the moment of conception. It wouldn't erase memory like traditional patents did. It would protect origin, context, and versioning. A digital witness, incorruptible. She knew the tech world wouldn't adopt it easily, but she also knew she no longer needed their permission. Late one night, after finishing a lesson on adaptive logic for a class of 14-year-olds, Naomi sat alone in the main room of the institute. The building was quiet. Through the tall windows, the city flickered like an ocean of broken stars. She pulled out her grandmother's notebook, still creased and frayed at the edges. There was a blank page Ruby had never written on. Naomi placed a single photo on top, a reprint of the mural from the city wall. Ruby's painted likeness stared into the distance, her hand reaching for a key that glowed in midair. Naomi smiled. Then, using a black pen, she wrote a sentence at the bottom of the page. It wasn't a quote or an equation. It was an invitation. Let no voice be lost again. She closed the notebook and went back to work. The first morning of spring arrived quiet and cold, the city still wrapped in the kind of mist that softened the corners of buildings and blurred the sharp edges of motion. The streets in Naomi's neighborhood had begun to shed their coat of winter ash, and tiny buds had started appearing on the skeletal branches of the trees lining the sidewalks. From her window, she could see children passing on their way to school, their backpacks bouncing against their backs, their voices muffled but lively, colliding with the rhythm of passing cars and trains. Inside the Code Ruby Institute, the fluorescent lights flickered awake as Naomi entered, key in hand, her breath still visible in the morning air. She walked down the main corridor slowly, her fingers tracing the bulletin board now covered with student inventions, sketches of sensor-driven prosthetics, modular drone designs, handwritten lines of Python scripts scrawled across loose-leaf paper, colored in bright markers like graffiti art. The walls pulsed with promise. It was unlike any lab she had seen, not just in form, but in feeling. It hummed, it breathed. She unlocked the main office and stepped inside. The room was modest: 2 desks, a wall-length whiteboard covered in flowcharts, a set of shelves heavy with old programming manuals and worn hard drives. On the far desk lay the latest prototype of the Living Ledger interface, her personal project now in its 3rd generation of refinement. She had designed it for future minds, not institutions. Minds like hers had once been, quiet, fast, and invisible. It would track ideas not just by timestamps, but by narrative flow, preserving how a thought became a breakthrough. It would not let another Ruby be erased. Naomi placed her bag down and opened the morning files. The inbox was full, as always. There were requests for collaboration from schools in Ghana, Mexico City, Mumbai. A teacher in Mississippi had sent a photo of her classroom using Code Ruby modules to build environmental sensors out of recycled phones. A student from Korea had written a poem inspired by Ruby's predictive architecture. A professor in Berlin had included the Living Ledger framework in her ethics curriculum. Naomi answered each message personally. It took time, but she believed it mattered. Connection could not be automated. It had to be held. Around noon, the doors of the center opened to the first wave of students. They moved through the space with the ease of ownership. They no longer hesitated to ask questions, to sketch wild solutions, to treat failure as just another shape of progress. One girl, Amira, age 12, rushed up to Naomi with a grin and a circuit board wrapped in pink tape. She had redesigned the interface on her own, using a method Naomi hadn't taught. It worked. Naomi knelt beside her and asked how she had done it. Amira shrugged. "I just thought it made more sense this way." Naomi smiled. "Then it probably does." That evening, after the last of the students had packed up their laptops and said their goodbyes, Naomi stayed behind to clean up. The room felt full even in its quiet. She gathered the leftover notebooks, wiped the whiteboard clean, powered down the projector. Then she crossed to the old wooden filing cabinet in the back corner and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside lay Ruby's original notebook, the one Naomi had once carried like a secret. The pages were softer now, the edges rounded by time and touch. Naomi opened to the last entry, her own handwriting, penned on a sleepless night. Let no voice be lost again. She reached for her pen. On the next blank page she wrote, "We are no longer echoes. We are source." The words felt right, complete. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Walter. "Turn on the news." Naomi opened the live stream from a local station. The anchor's voice came through before the video did. Breaking news from the Department of Justice this evening. Federal agents have served an arrest warrant for former Syntheon Dynamics CEO Nolan Vance. The charges include obstruction of scientific attribution, destruction of intellectual property, and conspiracy to commit patent fraud spanning 3 decades. The image came into focus. Vance, once the emblem of corporate genius, now being escorted through a lobby in handcuffs, his face blank with disbelief, his suit wrinkled, collar unbuttoned. Reporters called his name, shouted questions about Ruby Jackson. He didn't answer. He didn't look up. Naomi stood still, her breath shallow. It was not satisfaction she felt, it was release. Later that night, a ceremony was held at the newly reopened Midtown Science Center in what had once been Synthion's private auditorium. The crowd was different now, diverse, intergenerational, filled with students, scientists, families. Naomi took her place at the front row, flanked by Walter on one side and a woman she had never met in person on the other. Her name was Dr. Olivia Ekwueme, and she had once worked beside Ruby in the early years. She reached over and held Naomi's hand during the opening remarks. A screen lit up above the stage, showing a montage of Ruby's life. Not the stock image they had used in early articles, but real footage, walking through the lab in a long brown coat, scribbling equations on a classroom board, sitting at a desk with a cup of tea and a laughing girl in her lap. Naomi's voice echoed through the speakers, narrating the memory she had written for the occasion. My grandmother taught me that the most dangerous thing a system can fear is a mind that remembers. She remembered, even when they told her to forget. The audience rose in standing ovation when the screen faded to black. Outside, as the city buzzed with headlines and chatter, Naomi walked down the marble steps alone for a moment, letting the wind wash over her. She looked up at the night sky. The stars were faint behind the city lights, but they were there, constant, watching. She made her way to the side alley of the building, where a new installation had been unveiled earlier that day. A sculpture made of fused circuit boards, glass, and copper, shaped like an open notebook. The pages bore engraved names, names from the archive, names reclaimed, names once lost. At the center, Ruby Jackson. Naomi placed her hand on the metal. It was warm from the sun. A voice called her name from the street. It was one of the students, Daniel, age 13, always asking about machine learning models. He was waving from the sidewalk, bouncing in place. "You coming?" he asked. "You promised to play something." Naomi laughed. She had almost forgotten. They were gathering at the community center that night, just a few blocks away. It was Ruby's birthday. Naomi arrived to find the main room lit by strings of tiny lights, paper lanterns swaying gently in the breeze from the open windows. In the corner stood a small stage, no higher than a bench. On it rested a violin. It had been Ruby's. Naomi picked it up. Her fingers adjusted the bridge with care. She tuned the strings slowly, each note ringing out like breath. The room grew quiet. She stepped to the center of the stage and drew the bow across the strings. The first note was hesitant, trembling like a question, but the second note answered. Then came the third. And soon the music filled the room, melodies layered with memory, with joy and grief and survival. It was not a song she had written. It had always been there, buried in the silence, waiting to be played. When the final note faded, no one clapped. They didn't need to. They knew what they had heard. They had heard a new beginning, a new chapter. And this time, it had her name on it. If this story hooked you, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Want more stories like this? Watch the next video. It will surprise you. And don't forget to share this video with your friends.